The waitress warned him before signing the contract in English, and the whole restaurant was stunned. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Joseph locked the gate to his land, the worn key cool in his calloused hand. The dirt under his boots still held the chill of dawn, and the silence of the countryside was comforting, predictable. Behind him stretched acres of fertile soil, the same land his father and grandfather had once tended with bare hands and strong backs. To Joseph, it was more than property. It was legacy. It was life. "Ready, my friend?" David's voice called from the idling pickup at the edge of the road. Joseph turned. David leaned casually against the truck door, dressed in a city-slick blazer and polished shoes that hadn't touched soil in years. His smile was confident, his handshake warm, his voice persuasive. He was everything Joseph was not: educated, worldly, fluent in English, the perfect ally Joseph had once thought. As the engine rumbled to life, Joseph took one last glance at the land. He had no reason to doubt David. Not then. They'd grown up in the same town, played in the same rivers, shared secrets and bread. Now, they were headed to the city, to sign a deal that, according to David, would secure Joseph's future and bring jobs to the whole region. "The investors are serious," David had said weeks earlier, sipping espresso in Joseph's humble kitchen. "They want to build something sustainable, an eco-resort. They love the location, the streams, the hills. They just don't speak Spanish. Let me handle the talks, Joseph. I'll translate everything. All you have to do is be yourself." Joseph, a man of few words and even fewer illusions, had nodded. "If they respect the land, I'll listen." The city rose like a promise and a warning all at once: glass, metal, lights, and noise. Joseph watched it unfold from the passenger seat, his hands tense in his lap. The closer they got, the more out of place he felt. Men in suits moved with purpose along crowded sidewalks. Screens blinked with advertisements he couldn't read. The air smelled of gasoline and ambition. They checked into a hotel that cost more per night than Joseph usually spent in a week. David brushed off his concern with a laugh. "Relax," he said. "It's covered by the investors. They want to impress us." That evening, they walked to the restaurant where the meeting was scheduled. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was an empire of marble floors, glass chandeliers, and wine bottles displayed like art. A soft piano played in the background as they entered. Joseph instinctively removed his hat, holding it in both hands. He felt like a man who'd shown up to a wedding in work boots. "Don't worry," David said, clapping him on the back. "You're the landowner. You've got more power than anyone in this room. Just smile and let me do the talking." They were escorted to a private dining room, its doors heavy and silent as they closed behind them. Inside waited two investors, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, and eager. They stood to shake hands. Joseph nodded, unsure whether to speak. David took over instantly. "This is Mr. Joseph Aguilar," he said smoothly in English. "The man who owns all 600 acres. He's honored to be here, but he doesn't speak English. I'll be translating." Joseph offered a quiet smile. One of the investors responded with a thumbs up and a friendly grin. Joseph relaxed a little. At the other end of the room, unnoticed, a waitress moved with practiced precision. Jessica, her name tag read. Her ponytail was tight, her posture straight, but her eyes scanned everything. She had been working at the restaurant for just under a year. She had seen many meetings like this, deals made over champagne and steak, promises exchanged with too much laughter. Something about this one felt different. As she approached with menus, she caught David's voice in English. "Yes, I've owned the land since my father passed. It's untouched, just like your proposal described." Jessica paused, just for a fraction of a second, enough to catch a flicker of confusion on Joseph's face as David spoke words he didn't understand. She placed the menus gently on the table and excused herself, but her ears stayed open. Throughout the dinner, Joseph remained mostly silent. He nodded when David told him to, smiled politely, and occasionally tried to catch snippets of conversation he couldn't follow. David, on the other hand, spoke with confidence, gesturing with his wine glass, laughing in sync with the investors, referencing zoning laws and pre-approval for construction with casual authority. Jessica passed the table several times, unnoticed. She noticed plenty. Joseph never once corrected David, never interjected. He looked unsure, even lost. Later, in the staff area, Jessica approached the bartender quietly. "Hey," she asked in Spanish, "did you see that table in room 3? The guy in the denim shirt, he looked so out of place." The bartender shrugged. "Big money talks in there. Stay out of it." But Jessica couldn't let it go. When she cleared the dessert plates, David barely acknowledged her. He was too busy explaining how he'd manage the environmental concerns to keep the project compliant. Joseph blinked slowly, like a man trying to follow a play in a foreign language. As the guests stood to leave, David shook hands again and said in Spanish, "Everything went well. We're closer than ever. They love the land. Tomorrow we sign." Joseph nodded, trusting. "Gracias, amigo." Jessica, watching from the corner, felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Something didn't add up. The way David talked, the confidence, the way he kept saying "I" instead of "we." She watched Joseph walk out, shoulders slightly hunched, trusting every word David fed him, and that's when she knew. He had no idea he was being betrayed. Jessica didn't sleep well that night. The restaurant's soft music still echoed in her head, blending with David's voice, the way he spoke English so smoothly, so confidently, as if every word belonged to him. She kept seeing Joseph's face, the polite smile that never quite reached his eyes, the way he nodded without understanding. By the time her alarm rang, Jessica had already made up her mind about one thing. She was going to pay attention. Real attention. The second meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, again at the same restaurant, this time in a larger private room overlooking the city skyline. Jessica arrived early for her shift, her stomach tight with nerves. She told herself she was just being paranoid, that it wasn't her business, that rich men lying to poor men was nothing new in a place like this. But when she saw David and Joseph enter, something inside her shifted. David walked ahead, confident, already on his phone in English. Joseph followed a few steps behind, wearing the same clean but simple clothes, looking smaller than the city around him. "Everything okay?" Jessica's coworker asked as they watched the two men approach the host stand. "Yeah," Jessica lied, "just tired." She was assigned to their table again. As she poured water and set down folders the investors had left earlier, she listened. One of the investors smiled and said in English, "So David, once you sign, we can start the legal process immediately." David nodded. "Of course. Joseph is fully on board. He trusts my judgment." Joseph frowned slightly. "¿Qué dijo?" he asked quietly. David turned to him with an easy smile. "They're just saying the paperwork is ready for review." Jessica felt her chest tighten. That wasn't what he said. The meeting continued, and the lies became harder to ignore. Every time Joseph spoke, David shortened his words, twisted their meaning, or ignored them entirely. "Joseph, I want to make sure the water sources stay clean. My family depends on them." David, in English. "Environmental impact won't be an issue. I've already approved all the necessary adjustments." Joseph, "I don't want to sell everything, just a portion." David, "I'm open to full ownership transfer if the price is right." Jessica's hands shook as she carried plates of food to the table. This wasn't just exaggeration. This was theft. And then it happened. One of the investors slid a folder across the table. "This is the preliminary agreement. We just need your signature here, David." David took the pen without hesitation. Joseph leaned forward. "¿Qué es eso?" David didn't even look at him. "It's just a draft. Nothing official." But Jessica saw the top page. She didn't need to read every word. The name at the top was clear. David Harper, sole property owner. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Jessica retreated to the service hallway, her mind racing. Her entire body felt cold, as if she had just witnessed a crime in slow motion. She leaned against the wall, trying to breathe. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. David was actively stealing Joseph's land, and Joseph had no idea. "Jessica," her manager's voice snapped her back to reality. "Table 7 needs wine. And remember, no talking to clients unless it's service-related. Jessica nodded quickly. Yes, sir. But inside, a storm was building. She had come to this country with nothing. No family, no safety net. Her job paid just enough to survive. Her immigration papers were still in process. One complaint, one accusation of interfering, and she could lose everything. She looked back through the glass wall at Joseph. He was smiling again, trusting, completely unaware. The breaking point came when Jessica overheard David near the bar, speaking on the phone in English. Yes, once the deal is done, the land is legally mine. He doesn't even know what he's signing. Honestly, it's the easiest scam I've ever pulled. Jessica froze. Scam. Her fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. So after that, I'll disappear. New state, new name. He'll never see it coming. Jessica didn't wait to hear more. She walked straight into the bathroom and locked herself in a stall, her heart pounding so hard it felt painful. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale, scared, but angry, in a way she had never felt before. This wasn't just about business. This was about dignity, about a man who trusted his best friend with his entire life, and about a woman who now knew the truth. Her shift ended an hour later. Jessica stood in the locker room staring at her phone, at her reflection, at the tiny notebook she kept in her bag for English practice. If she stayed silent, nothing would happen to her. If she spoke up, everything could fall apart. She thought about her mother, who used to say, "Silence also chooses a side." Jessica took a pen and tore out a page. Her hands shook as she wrote in Spanish. "Joseph, I'm sorry to interfere, but your friend is lying. He is telling the investors that he owns your land. The documents have his name, not yours. Please do not sign anything. You are being betrayed." She read it 3 times, folded it, and walked back into the restaurant. Joseph and David were standing near the exit, waiting for their ride. David was laughing, relaxed, already victorious. Jessica approached slowly, her heart in her throat. "Sir," she said softly in Spanish, only looking at Joseph, "you forgot this." She slipped the folded paper into his hand. Their eyes met for a second, long enough for Joseph to sense the urgency, long enough for David to notice something was wrong. "What was that?" David asked, suspicious. "Just his receipt," Jessica said quickly, already stepping back. David frowned but didn't push it. Joseph waited until they were outside, until David was distracted on another call. Then he unfolded the paper. He read it once, twice. His smile faded. His hands began to tremble. He looked up at David, who was still laughing into his phone, completely unaware. Joseph felt something unfamiliar spreading through his chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. Doubt. For the first time in years, Joseph wondered if the man he called his best friend had been lying to him all along. Joseph barely slept. The folded note from Jessica stayed on the nightstand beside his bed, unread in the dark but impossible to forget. He is telling the investors that he owns your land. The words played on repeat in his mind, clashing with 1,000 memories of David, their childhood, their shared dreams, the promises. How could it be a lie? How could someone like David, who sat at his mother's funeral and cried beside him, betray him? And yet, something in Jessica's eyes had struck him. Not fear, not hesitation. It was something stronger. Conviction. At sunrise, Joseph left the hotel quietly. David was still sleeping, unaware that trust had finally cracked. Jessica waited outside a corner cafe near the restaurant, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee. Her heart leapt when she saw Joseph approaching alone. "You came," she said, rising to her feet. "I had to," Joseph said, voice low. "You put your job on the line for me." "I had to," she echoed, then sat again. Joseph sat across from her, hat in hand. "Tell me everything." And she did. She told him about the first meeting, the way David claimed ownership of the land, The second meeting, where David lied about what Joseph was saying. She told him about the documents, the signature line with David's name, not his. She repeated exact words David had used to the investors and over the phone. Joseph didn't interrupt, but with every sentence his fingers clenched tighter around the brim of his hat. Why would he do this? He asked, more to himself than her. Because you trusted him, Jessica said gently, and because he thought no one would notice. Joseph looked away. I want to believe you, but I've known him my whole life. I know, she said. That's why we're going to prove it. They came up with the plan together. Jessica knew someone, an old customer at the restaurant, Mr. Thompson, an elderly retired lawyer who spent most mornings drinking tea and reading the paper alone. He was fluent in Spanish and kind enough to help. Joseph would play along, go through with the final investor meeting as if nothing was wrong. He'd let David talk, let him lie, let him push the contract across the table. Meanwhile, Jessica would get a copy of the final agreement and have Mr. Thompson translate it. If the contract listed David as the sole owner, they'd bring it into the room. Let the truth speak for itself. Later that afternoon, in the same private dining room where this all began, Joseph sat at the table across from the investors. His hands were still, but his heart thundered like hooves in his chest. David arrived minutes later looking refreshed and smug, folder in hand. You ready? He asked in Spanish, clapping Joseph on the shoulder. This is it, hermano. Your future begins today. Joseph smiled. I trust you. David smiled back, not knowing how bitter those words had become. The investors entered, shaking hands, thanking David again for his cooperation and flexibility. One of them chuckled. He really made this deal smooth. Joseph said nothing. The papers were laid out on the table, neatly stacked and clipped. This is the final agreement, one of the men said. Once signed, we wire the initial payment to the registered owner. Joseph nodded slowly, his fingers hovering just above the pen David offered. That's when the door opened. Jessica walked in with firm steps, holding a translated copy of the contract in her hands. Behind her, Mr. Thompson followed, quiet, professional, and clearly uninvited. Excuse me, Jessica said, ignoring her manager who was already calling out behind her. But before any signing happens, I think you should read this. David stood up, eyes wide. What the hell are you doing? Jessica didn't look at him. She handed the paper to the nearest investor. This is an English to Spanish translation of the contract you were about to have Joseph sign, prepared by a licensed attorney. It lists David Harper as the sole and legal property owner, despite Joseph being the real owner of the land. Silence fell like a dropped glass. The investor began reading, frowning. David's face paled. This is ridiculous. She's just a waitress. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Mr. Thompson stepped forward calmly. I'm a retired real estate lawyer, and I can confirm what she's saying. This contract transfers ownership of the land to David Harper entirely. Joseph Aguilar's name does not appear anywhere as a legal owner. David laughed nervously, trying to hold control. Look, there must be a misunderstanding. Joseph agreed to let me represent him. It's just a placeholder. Joseph stood up. His voice was low, but it cut through the room. No more lies, David. David turned to him, playing innocent. Come on, man. You know me. I was just trying to help. You said you'd translate, that you'd help me, not steal from me. David opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to spin. One of the investors slammed the folder shut. Is this true? Jessica nodded. I heard him say it myself, twice, once to you, once on the phone. David's composure shattered. You stupid girl. Do you know what you've done? I told the truth, Jessica replied. Joseph looked at David one last time, the friend who had eaten at his table, walked his land, shared his life, and saw a stranger. Then he turned to the investors. I will not sign anything I can't read. Not now. Not ever. He gathered the papers into a neat pile, placed the pen down, and walked out without another word. Jessica followed, her hands trembling, her heart full of fire. Behind them, David stood frozen, surrounded by broken trust and undeniable proof. The con was over. The city was quieter the morning after David's scheme fell apart, or at least it felt that way to Joseph. He stood at the hotel window, looking down at the streets he once found intimidating. The suits, the horns, the fast steps, they hadn't changed. But he had. A knock came at the door. When he opened it, two plainclothes officers stood outside. "Mr. Aguilar?" one of them asked. Joseph nodded. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about Mr. David Harper." The authorities moved quickly. With the contract as evidence, the investor statements, and Jessica's testimony, David didn't stand a chance. He was arrested later that day while trying to board a flight out of state. The news broke fast. It turned out David wasn't a first-time offender. He had changed names and states twice in the last 5 years, always promising business deals, always targeting people like Joseph, those who had something valuable but didn't speak the language of contracts, cities, or greed. His face appeared briefly on a local news segment. Joseph didn't watch it. He didn't need to. He had already seen the truth in person. When the investors reached back out to Joseph, their tone had changed entirely. This time, they didn't come with charm and champagne. They came with humility and a translator. "We want to start over," one of them said, this time in Spanish. "Properly, respectfully." Joseph agreed to listen, but he was no longer the quiet man from the countryside who nodded along. Every line of the new contract was reviewed with care. Every clause translated by a certified legal interpreter. Every handshake earned. The land would not be sold. Instead, Joseph would lease a portion for development under strict conditions. The environment would be preserved, the local community involved, and Joseph would remain the land's rightful owner, with final say on every decision. It was the deal he should have been offered in the first place. Jessica was called into a separate meeting the following week. She expected a warning, maybe even a quiet firing. After all, she had broken protocol, walked into a private client room, interrupted a high-stakes deal. Instead, the lead investor shook her hand and said, "You saved us from a lawsuit, and you saved a good man from losing everything." Jessica blinked, stunned. He continued, "We're expanding operations into Joseph's region. We need someone who understands people, someone who sees what others miss. Would you be willing to help lead that?" Jessica looked at the man, then at the polished office around her. It felt surreal. She took a breath. "Yes," she said, "but only if we do it the right way. Fair pay, legal protections, training for locals, and no more contracts that people can't read." The investor smiled. "That's exactly why we want you." 2 months later, Joseph stood once again at the edge of his land, but this time, he wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside him, dressed in boots instead of heels, clipboard in hand, wind in her hair. She had just returned from visiting a group of local women who would soon be trained as eco-guides for the new nature trails. A modest lodge had begun construction on one small ridge. It used sustainable wood, local labor, and blended into the landscape rather than trying to conquer it. Joseph insisted on that. The fields were still his, the orchard untouched, the river clean. Jessica handed him a copy of the latest site plan. "They made all the edits you asked for." He smiled, folding it carefully. "Good, no more surprises." They walked along the ridge in silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind them. "You know," Joseph said, "if you hadn't spoken up." Jessica stopped him with a look. "You would have figured it out." He shook his head. "Not in time." Jessica smiled. "Maybe. But either way, you trusted me." That took courage, too. They stood there, overlooking a future that almost slipped away. A farmer and a waitress. A landowner and a director. Two people who didn't belong in boardrooms, but who changed the game anyway. Justice had been served. But more than that, dignity had been restored, and something new was growing now. Not just buildings or business plans, but trust and hope, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be silent.